Hello everyone, my name is Skylar Fox, this is Project Mycer, and today's episode will be on making a boss fight and implementing difficulty modes. In a previous video, I showed two basic enemy types the player will encounter and talked about many of the challenges that come from designing those kinds of enemies. One of the biggest ones being that I had to dumb down the enemy AI a little bit so as to not let the player be rushed by multiple enemies all at once. However, when working with a boss fight like this, where it is designed to be a 1v1 fight, I didn't have to account for this balancing act. What I did have to account for is that this is the very first boss players will encounter in the game. At this point in the game, the player is expected to have fought a few basic enemies and have at least a bare minimum understanding of combat. So the idea is to make this enemy feel like a slight increase in difficulty for newcomers, but not so much that it turns them away from the rest of the game. It should be a boss that requires them to prove they have a good understanding of how combat works. This enemy is a masked sword-wielding warrior with close-ranged attacks. He's very agile, so he'll be running around, jumping around, and dodging player attacks. One of the things I was very conscious of when designing the boss was making sure that it wasn't something that could just be beaten by the player mashing the attack buttons. In the Kingdom Hearts games, this problem is typically handled by something the community has nicknamed revenge value, where enemies will start to counter or evade the player's attacks once they have been hit a certain number of times. I decided to implement a similar mechanic in this boss fight. To do this, I simply added integer variables to the enemy parent blueprint class, and this variable would be added to each time an enemy gets hit. I also caused the variable to reset once the enemy starts to actually perform an attack or a dodge, regardless of circumstance. While I want this mechanic to prevent player combo loops, I don't want the punishment to be too harsh in this fight, especially as it is the first boss the player will face. Attacks triggered by this mechanic will have a long enough of a windup that the player should at least have enough time to either dodge away or guard, and in easier difficulty modes, this mechanic will instead just cause the enemy to either guard or dodge away from the player. Speaking of difficulty modes, this game has 4 of them: Story, Beginner, Intermediate, and Hard. Story mode, as one may expect, makes it nearly impossible for the player to actually lose, and enemies can be defeated very easily. Difficulty modes are often a contentious topic in the gaming community, but the main reason I wanted to include a story difficulty setting is because I think of many family members and friends who I would like to be able to experience the game in some way, even if they aren't too interested in video games as a whole. Beginner mode increases the player's defense and strength while lowering the enemies, and Intermediate is the base game's difficulty that I will be balancing around. Hard mode will increase enemy stats and increase enemy AI aggression. For an example of how I handled it with this fight, this boss will detect if the player is in a hard difficulty setting, and if they are, they will perform attacks immediately after dodging or guarding against the player. Also, if the enemy is guarding and the player attacks, in normal difficulties, the enemy will simply hold their ground without getting hurt. But in hard mode, they will perform a hard-hitting counterattack that takes a good chunk of the player's health. One thing I also added to the hard difficulty mechanic is that experience points rewarded to the player for deflecting an enemy's attack is increased, which can then act as an incentive for players to take some more risks during combat to try to actually deflect enemy attacks, and doing so will help them level up faster than in easier difficulty modes. I want to make each difficulty mode have different advantages to selecting them instead of just a simple slider that says player has more health, enemy has less health. Which is why I started implementing difficulty features like this right away, despite being pretty early in the project still. It'll only be more difficult to add mechanics like this to the game the longer that I put it off for. As the project develops and I eventually get more hands playtesting it, I should gain a better idea of how combat actually feels to the average player, and whether each difficulty mode achieves their intended effect. Balancing game difficulty is really hard since difficulty is one of the most subjective things out there in games. I often think about how Kingdom Hearts 3 released, and one of its biggest complaints was how easy it was, because it was clearly trying to target younger demographics. To make up for this, they added Critical Mode to come out later as a free update to the game, but as a result, you have this massive difficulty spike from Proud Mode to Critical Mode, and so the solution still wasn't exactly perfect. I don't know if I can avoid that kind of scenario, but I'd like to try. If any of you have suggestions on how to handle difficulty modes, or if you would like to drop some general feedback on how the game is looking or how this boss fight is looking, feel free to leave those in the comments below. That will be it for today's video. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you are interested in keeping up with this project's development, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.